one of the most intriguing elements of your book that I found, and this is just kind of a sample of what the type of information your book contains throughout, is Papyri 45 is a manuscript that dates to around 250 A.D. and contains sections of each canonical gospel, along with a large section from the book of Acts. As a sample of the type of work you do in Jesus and His World, will you explain how this papyri relates to what you describe as the longevity of ancient texts, and also what are the implications of that relationship for our understanding of the textual transmission of the New Testament?
Well, that's a good question, and it's a recent discovery. Some research that's been done just in the last few years on collections of, or libraries, collections of books that have been found in the dry sands of Egypt, where the entire library, complete with correspondence, has been thrown out, and then we can reassemble it. And we know, well, this family had a number of books, and here are the letters where they write letters and ask that a copy of it be made. And, of course, we actually have dates when we have letters.
Right.
And what we discovered, among many things that were very interesting, such as questions of literacy, study, scribal skills, and that sort of thing, one of the things we learned was the great longevity of these books. And so a papyrus book, or even a book written on animal skin, these books tended to last anywhere from 150 years to 400 or 500 years. Wow. It was just a huge longevity.
Amazing.
They'd get badly worn, but they were very cared for very carefully. And then the library eventually got thrown out. I think in Egypt it was because of the Islamic conquest, and so people weren't reading Greek as much as they used to, and these books were just thrown out. Now, this is what struck me when I read up on this, and it was, as I said, very recent studies that indicated this. I saw the implication for some of the oldest surviving Greek New Testaments that we have, and you mentioned papyrus number 45, which was relevant for my book because it's a papyrus that contains, as you just said, large chunks of all four Gospels. And this papyrus is dated somewhere in the first half of the 3rd century, in other words, from as early as 200 to as late as 240 or perhaps 250. And what occurred to me was that when the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written in the second half of the 1st century, that is, probably from the 60s to the 90s of the 1st century, the original manuscripts could easily have survived until the time that Papyrus 45 was actually copied. The old assumption that I had, I held it for a long time when I was in school, and I think most New Testament scholars assume that when a manuscript was written, it didn't last very long, that it circulated and perhaps in 10 or 20 years was falling apart and discarded. And, meanwhile, a new copy is made. And so by the time you get to the year 200 or 250, the New Testament Gospels have been copied repeatedly. Perhaps the text has lost some of its integrity. Scribes do make mistakes. And so you end up with lots of variants and perhaps errors and so on. But what this discovery suggests is that, well, even as late as the year 200 or even 250, the original Gospels, and that would include, of course, Paul's own letters and the other contents of the New Testament, the originals could still be in circulation. And in fact, a church father writing around the year 200, Tertullian, says that some of the original letters of Paul could still be seen at a city in Asia Minor.
Wow.
And, of course, when Tertullian said that, it was hard to believe it. People thought, oh, he must be mistaken, or maybe we're not understanding him right. Maybe he doesn't mean the originals. Maybe he just means good copies or something like that. Now we realize, because of this papyri evidence that's been uncovered in Egypt, he could actually be talking about the original letters that Paul himself had written, that he himself signed with his own name, And the other thing we learned, too, is that when an original was copied, or when Matthew, let us say, wrote his gospel in the first century, there was not just a single copy that was then issued, but multiple copies would have come from his own pen.
Right.
And so there would be more than just one original, but several, 2, 3, 4, we're not sure how many that then would have circulated. And so the chances of one of those originals lasting 150 or 200 years, those odds are rather pretty good.
Right. So there might be multiple autographs.
That's right.
Rather than just a single.
That's right. And that's, in fact, I realize now, oh, sure, we see that at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. We find multiple copies, and one of them was a letter, in fact, on how the law was supposed to be obeyed. And we found no fewer than 6 copies of this letter. Wow. And they probably were all prepared by the original sender of the letter, and that's because the letter was to be sent out in various destinations. So when we think of Paul's letter, for example, to the churches of Galatia, it is very probable that multiple copies were sent out. How many, we don't know, but Paul would have sent out 2, 3, 4, something like that, and would have retained a copy for his own use. And so we shouldn't think then of a single copy that lasts a few years and then gets recopied, and then that copy is copied, and so on. That happens, but we have these originals which then circulate for a long time, and so they then stabilize the textual tradition. Right. You don't end up with as much variation or with as many errors as you might think, because the originals themselves are still circulating and available for comparison.
Right. So it's reinforcing it very strongly, actually.
I would think so.
And that the derivatives that come from them, like your second-generation text, if you will, is based, you have multiple second-generation texts that would have been based on original autographs.
That's right. Okay. And so when the scribe who wrote out what we call Papyrus 45, whenever he wrote it at the beginning of the 3rd century,
right,
we should not assume that all he had access to was a 10th generation copy or something like that. He may well have had before him a copy of an original. Conceivably, he even had before him an original. That we have to be open to that possibility.
So, and then another implication would be then is that the generational descent of the text is likely to be less voluminous, so to speak, between the originals and the next generation, or how long those originals lasted.
That's right.
The implications are astounding in terms of the textual transmission and how it occurs. Do you think that we were assuming that the ancient world was producing books in a way that's similar to the way we would produce them? In our evaluation of looking back at those texts and saying, well, we produced the master copy, and then all other copies are made from that, like we do with a printing press. So we have the master text that gets turned into a book. Were we assuming that they were doing the same things that we do?
Well, yeah, I think we can't help it as modern people. We tend to use the way we do things as the default position. And so for us, what is normative is a mass-produced book. And so we carefully proofread, 2 or 3 proofreaders carefully go over it. We try to eliminate every typographical error, every misspelling. We try to get it exactly letter perfect. It goes to the printer, and then several thousand exact copies are made.
Right.
And if there happens to be 2 or 3 typographical errors in the master, then they get replicated, and all of the copies have those same few errors. Well, in antiquity, of course, every time a scribe made a copy, he's going to introduce a change here or there. Some of them might actually improve the text a little bit. Some of them are careless mistakes, a slip of the eye, something like that. And in other cases, he just doubles up and repeats the same word and that kind of thing. But the ancients knew this, and what we don't know is that they had proofreaders too. A proofreader was called a diorthotos or a diorthotes. He was a person who sat down and proofread a text, and then a clean copy was made from, this carefully proofread text, which probably still had a few errors in it.
Sure.
And then there would be copies made of copies. Now, what we learned in finding these libraries is that the ancients knew this, and so that's why they would get multiple copies and compare them. And so they were engaging in what we today call textual criticism. Well, that's what they were doing a long time ago. So they weren't stupid.
Right.
And so they were fully aware that a given manuscript might have some copyist errors in it. And so they would compare and carefully read and discern what the correct reading was. So even if they had 2 or 3 imperfect copies that they were comparing, they could deduce almost always correctly what the original reading was. Well, we need to understand that that's what Christian scribes were doing too. So they were smart enough to get a sense of what the original reading was, and they weren't as hung up as we are today over the question of the original reading. What they were really after was the original sense. And so was the text, was it being rightly understood? And so in Greek you might have 2 or 3 words to choose from which said basically the same thing. Or the word order could be 2 or 3 different ways and still say the same thing. And they weren't too concerned about that. The concern was rather, are we conveying what Paul said? Are we understanding what he said? Or do we have the words of Jesus right so we understand what's being said? And this hang-up on the word-for-word part of the text, that's more of a modern thing and less so something from antiquity, simply because of the reality of handwritten manuscripts had variants, right. Whereas we moderns expect the printed text to be absolutely free of any misspellings or typos.
Right, and if it isn't, then we immediately start to think of some type of maliciousness in the background that's changing the text.
Yes, we view, that's right. It strikes us as very strange. What a lot of lay people don't know, and this is an analogy that I think is worth thinking about. I write up an original manuscript. I mean, we're talking about one right now, my book on archaeology.
Right.
Well, I wrote it up. I proofread it myself several times. I caught a bunch of typos, punctuation things, and so on. I went through it very carefully, got it nice, neat, and clean, and sent it to the publisher. Well, the publisher hands it to a copy editor, or what in antiquity was a diorthetos. Mm-hmm. And this person then looks at it and carefully proofread it, and then, of course, didn't just correct obvious mistakes, misspellings, grammatical slips, whatever, but then actually changed some words and adjusted some sentences so that they read perhaps a little more economically, a little more smoothly, a little more clearly, chose a different word, had in mind British readers too, by the way.
Okay.
And so made a few alterations here and there, and sent back to me this copy-edited version, and here I am as the author looking at what is no longer the original. You see what I mean? It's been slightly corrected. Well, I was happy with it. In my view, it made it even better. And so then off it went to the press, and out it came as a book. So what you're calling right now the original, what's on your desk that you're looking at right now, is not actually what I submitted to the publisher. It's about 99% the same, but it isn't 100% the same. And I'm the guy that wrote it, and I look at it and think, hey, good job, you guys did well. Well, a little bit of that happened. I mean, you think about Paul, he's in prison, he's writing a letter, he's dictating it. Who knows how good the lighting is? Who knows how difficult the circumstances are? Mm-hmm. And a later scribe copies it and makes a few slight improvements, perhaps involving spelling, grammar, or whatever. Do you think Paul would be concerned with that? I think he'd say, "Oh, thanks, good job. I'm glad you did that." So we need to be realistic, I think, and not talk ourselves into a corner with ideas about what inspiration ought to be, or inerrancy, or something like that, and put ourselves into a position that cannot be defended, and in fact is contrary to common sense and practice.